This podcast is brought to you by sarahraven.com, which is home to everything you need for a truly beautiful and productive garden. You'll also find great and essential gardening kit and stylish, lovely things to have in your house to bring the outside indoors, all inspired by the garden and the house being tied together. There's also plenty of garden inspiration, how-to videos and specialist growing guides. So head over to sarahraven.com today to discover even more. Welcome to Grow, Cook, Eat, Arrange, the podcast of me, Sarah Raven, and various different guests. And today I've got somebody who I've actually never met, but I absolutely know her writing and her work through River Cottage. My guest today is Rachel de Thample. Now, have I pronounced it right?
Well, in America, it's de Thample, but that's with a bit of a Texas twang, which is where I'm from.
Okay, very good. So got that wrong, Sarah, but there we are.
It's okay.
So yes, I've come across her through an old friend of mine, Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall, who runs the whole River Cottage setup. And Rachel has now done 2 books, and they do these really completely excellent handbooks, which I'm sure lots of you know about, actually with the same publisher as me, with Bloomsbury. And they are just so unbelievably good. They're done by a specialist, normally with a foreword by Hugh, but they're people who are linked in some way with Park Farm and River Cottage, the whole setup down there in Dorset. But they've got real, incredibly detailed knowledge, but they're also beautifully written and beautifully photographed and illustrated. And Rachel has done 2 of them. Mm-hmm. And her first one that she did with them was on fermentation, which we'll talk about a little bit less maybe. But her next one that is out right now, literally this month or last month, is on River Cottage bees and honey. And it's not only about beekeeping, but also about pollinators in general, but it's also a cookbook about how to use honey. And so that's why I wanted to get Rachel on the podcast, because there are so many links to the garden, to food, to honey, to pollinators, which are things that I'm passionate about. And in fact, Rachel's coming to teach a course in the first week of June at Perch Hill, because quite often we link with the whole River Cottage setup. So hello and welcome. And I'm sorry I got the pronunciation of your name wrong, but
no problem.
We have so much in common that it's just really fun to have you here. So tell us, Rachel, about your background and how you've got to writing the books and what you're up to.
Yeah, well, I grew up in the US, and I really realized this summer I went to where, for me, my food journey started, Chez Panisse in Berkeley, California. And I hadn't realized really until I was there how much that it has shaped everything I've done. And it was the most magical experience. It's always been in my background. I've always wanted to go there. I have most of Alice's books, apart from the one I got Hugh for his birthday, signed by her. And I was like, why didn't I get myself one? But her autobiography.
Yeah.
But she is just astounding. She is a complete forerunner in the whole world of, farm to table, and really shows, the power of starting planting a seed, basically. She's planted a seed, where she is. And I went there and I didn't want to just book a table at the restaurant and have dinner and leave. So I wrote to them, and very lucky when you work for River Cottage, it does open doors quite easily. And I had a really, really lovely response. And it was quite a funny coincidence, because the general manager, who's also Alice's PA, he had already booked to come to River Cottage the same time I had booked to go to California, but we had an overlap. So I invited him on one of my courses, and then I went and I did a stage and spent a day in the kitchens of Chez Panisse. And it was just the most magical experience. It was like there's that really beautiful film, I think it's called A Taste of Things, with Juliette Binoche.
Yes.
Which is the most dreamy food scenes. And the whole service was like that film. It was just everything I could imagine and more. I started the day sitting at the table with the chefs. We were pulling the leaves from chard that had just come in from one of their farms. It was still glistening as if it had just been picked. And we looked at all the produce and talked about it. And the menu was decided for that evening at lunchtime.
Yeah.
And then the chefs diplomatically divided up the menu, like you're going to do the starter. And so it wasn't just, like you're just like on the donkey tray over there. And it was just really amazing. So that made me realize why I do what I do when I was there. And that was just an astonishing experience. But my background is journalism. And I came to London when I was in my early 20s. I studied in London and then came back on a work visa and ended up meeting someone, got married, and have been here for longer than I've been anywhere else, really, in the UK. So since I was 20, I've been in the UK, and I'm nearly 50, so big chunk of my life. But I realized when I started writing that I wanted to write about food, and I wanted to write about it. I worked in local TV in America, and it was putting the microphone in people's faces who were, struggling with bereavements, or there were just, homicide stories, or really fluffy like cat stories as well. Yeah. And I just thought that aspect of journalism wasn't for me, and that aspect of writing didn't sit right with me. And I thought food is such an amazing subject because it touches on culture in such a deep way. It touches on agriculture, ecology, the environment, health, which has always been an interest of mine. So it was just it was the obvious subject after I thought about it a little bit and had to, decide what I wanted to write about. So I worked as a chef for a bit to give myself some food credentials. And I found a diary that I wrote when I was working at Quo Vadis 30 years ago. It was one of Marco Pierre-White's restaurants at the time. And it was really funny. It was I have to say, it was a bit like Boiling Point back then. I think it might be different with Jeremy Lee at the helm. And just obviously times have changed in the kitchen as well. But it was funny. I should have done something with that. I would have been way ahead of my time with the Boiling Point thing. But very entertaining. But I interviewed Hugh. I was the commissioning editor at Waitrose Food Illustrated, and we were big fans of River Cottage. He was really in his early days of River Cottage back then. And I was writing an article about meat, and he had just written his meat book. So I was put in touch with him, interviewed him. It was so lovely and so interesting. And so I kept in touch and really started to follow what he was doing. I've never been a big TV watcher, so I hadn't actually seen any of his TV programs when I first spoke to him. But I binged watched them when my son was little.
Right.
And it was the perfect time because my son's been exposed to River Cottage from the earliest stage. So my son has had the best diet his whole life, whereas I grew up with a very mixed diet. My grandparents grew food and my granny pickled, so a lot of my pickling and fermenting and preserving stems from that, and my love of growing. I think it's genetically wired in all of us because that's where we come from. But I think sometimes when you move away and you live in a city, but your grandparents and your parents' gardens, it starts to spring up in you, and you just can't. You have to deal with it at some point.
Yeah,
and,
absolutely.
And I was living in London, and my first book was called Less Meat, More Veg, but it was really a message. I mean, probably inspired by my first interview with Hugh about meats, like really respecting meat and, buying the best meat you can and making it stretch and really valuing it. And I was, trying to put a point of balancing it with more vegetables. But the main point was connection. And I realized that I wasn't connecting enough with my food because I was living in a flat in London. I didn't have a garden. So I wanted to change that. And he was doing a lot of campaigning around, you could do garden shares, you could set up community gardens.
Yes.
There was a lot of money at the time as well for projects because it was 2012. It was Capital Growth, which is a sustained project, food and farming charity. They had lots of money to support setting up community gardens. So I think I have all the certificates. I set up about 5 or 6 in that year. So I never do things in small measures. And but I went to my local park group and said, have you thought about planting any edibles? And we planted a whole native hedgerow. And I remember putting the saplings in thinking, oh my God, I'm going to have to wait 5 years before I get any rose hips or sloes. But I've actually picked rose hips from that hedgerow and taken them to River Cottage because it's such a lush, abundant, mature site because time does pass quickly. But I really wanted to connect, and that really pushed me further towards River Cottage. And I started teaching there, and then eventually moved down that way. So
okay, so you live down there now.
I live down there
Fantastic. Now. So tell us about your passion for bees, really. And I mean, I know it's not just honeybees, but that is quite a part of your book. But so, yeah, just talk us through that a little bit.
Yes, well, I think I've always had a curiosity about food. My mother was really enthusiastic when we were kids about, us just trying lots of foods, and she made everything really interesting. So I always had this curiosity about knowing more, like where does the food come from? And bees, and I've always loved honey, and I just wanted to, know more about the process of, how the honey comes to the fore. So I took an interest in beekeeping, and I had all these community growing projects. And we had talked about setting up beehives and some of the projects. And then, funny enough, I was asked to write the River Cottage Bees and Honey book. And this was back in, I think it was 2018, actually. So it's taken a long time for it to come out.
Yeah.
Part of it was delayed by lockdown because I established a space to set up a hive. Actually, I had an allotment, and they had an apiary hive where there were a few different beekeepers. And it was a really amazing setup because you could shadow expert beekeepers. And that's really, we'll probably go into a bit more, but that's, if you want to get into beekeeping, it's best to shadow someone who knows what they're doing and get a taster before you commit, because it is, it's a big deal to be setting up a house for these insects. But I've always loved nature and insects. I used to spend my time laying in the grass listening to the cicadas and catching, which is probably a bit cruel now that I look at it, but I would try to catch lightning bugs. So we had them loads in the US where I grew up, and I would try to make lanterns out of them, or I used to try to squeeze the sap from the honeysuckles to make my own little glass of my own jar of honey. Never very successful. But yeah, I've always taken an interest in insects, and bees in particular, because they are such important species in terms of pollination and our food production.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if you were to name, I don't know, 5 or 6 of the things that as gardeners, because this is primarily a gardening podcast, of course, that you feel over the years in your experience are the absolute winners, what would they be?
Yeah, I would say thyme is one of the top. It is my top plant. I think if you're interested in planting for bees, it's good to go around other gardens and just see where the activity is. So thyme is one of the top ones, and thyme is interesting as well because the oils in thyme are really good for human health as well as bee health. And if you were to have a hive and to do any treatments, varroa mite treatment has thymus oil in it, so it goes right back. So the bees are really clever, and it's interesting. Animals in general, and we've lost a lot of that natural instinct that we have innate in us to go towards different herbs. But I've been involved with lots of different farmers in the organic sector throughout my career. And one of them I worked with, they did a study, it was with cows, but they set up a wildflower meadow and a herb meadow, and they were treating the cows homeopathically, and they would let the cows go and graze, and they would look at what they were going for, and then they would take them back and test them for different things, and they were self-medicating basically. And bees do the same. So bees actually, they forage mushrooms as well. There's a mushroom called wine cap that bees go for, and they'll roll in the spores and bring that back to the honey as a medicinal, like we're buying all these powders and putting it in to our coffees and lattes and stuff now. But, bees are doing that as well because they know. So thyme is top of the tree.
Okay.
Another one that's similar to thyme that I'm always surprised that people don't know this herb. And I think it's actually, in a way, it's the supermarket's faults because they're not selling it. And I have no idea why they don't, because it's the most robust herb. And I'm sure this is one that you know and love, but summer savory and winter savory. But when the flowers come out, the bees go bonkers. Yeah. It is the most beautiful plant. And it's pretty much evergreen. It never dies back. It's so luscious and beautiful. Flavor-wise, it's great as well. So I'm naming a lot of things that also, we have benefit too. And you can plant them not just for the bees and their beauty, but also, for our own health as well.
Completely. I love summer savoury. I find summer and winter savoury is much more used in Northern European cooking.
Absolutely.
I come across it a lot in the Netherlands where I spend quite a lot of time. They use it a lot there, I think.
Yeah, I've seen it on the menu at Oak and Bath, and that's the only menu really I've seen it on in recent times. But yeah, it definitely needs a revival and a bit of a celebration for sure.
Yeah.
Oregano is another one, still on the herbs. It is really medicinally, human health wise as well. It's so lush. It's really generous when it gets growing. It can be a bit over, can dominate a patch, but it's fantastic. Bees love it. And it's just a beautiful thing. The flowers are gorgeous.
Yeah.
Globe artichokes as well. So I am going quite foodie here, but I think when you let them flower, oh my God, the smell is fantastic and the bees love it. And we have some really beautiful photos. I could have dedicated the whole chapter to the photos that we have of the bees foraging on the nectar from the globe artichokes and thistles and everything in that family. Again, really good. So one of my interests is gut health, linking up with fermentation.
Yeah.
And globe artichokes are fantastic. They're full of prebiotic fiber, really good plant to have. And actually my favorite vegetable as well. And the most beautiful thing artistically, I think I always get like completely wooed by any art that has a globe artichoke in it. It just, wins me over.
Yeah, totally. And maybe a couple more?
Yeah, well, one of my favorite things, borage is one that's a bit more obvious, but alkanet, which is its wild, a bit invasive sister, tastes the same, tiny blue flowers. But a lot of people, just say, oh, it's this horrible weed in my garden, but actually the bees love it. And not only do they love it, it attracts a really wide variety of different bees. So that's the one that I love bee spotting on, because you can spot many different species of bees. And I've noted throughout the book, like different things you can plant and what different species they will attract as well. So you can get a variety and you're not just targeting, a narrow sort of spectrum of the bee world, but to get lots of different bees, it's the best way of spending an afternoon when it's sunny, just sitting in the garden, looking at the flowers and seeing how many bees you can spot.
Yeah. I just recently interviewed Richard Rickett. I don't know if you know him, he's a beekeeper.
Yes.
And he was saying exactly that it's just so nice getting to know different bees. And so something like borage, if you've got 3 or 4 different species in one place, it's so good because you can compare one with another and it really helps your sort of identification skills. And I find that with alliums is that quite often, particularly a Nectarscordum bulgaricum, which is the shade-loving allium, but sometimes I might get 5 or 6 different species on a clump of alliums.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah.
I actually, when it was so hard when I was asked to send over sort of my top 10, it was so hard to narrow it down, but I love, alliums. I remember spending about 20 minutes photographing a bee taking nectar from a chive flower.
Yes.
And I got it took me 20 minutes, but I got its tongue out and I was so happy.
Yeah.
It's just, it's very addictive watching bees foraging. It's just a beautiful,
But I've
beautiful
always wanted
sight.
to ask a beekeeper, do you think that if they've eaten allium nectar, like from a chive or whatever, do you think it taints the honey? Does it give it a sort of oniony taste?
Well, it's interesting because I've tried a lot of it's funny, I've developed this weird relationship with monofloral honeys, because monoculture is not a positive thing. I think my main message in the book is diversity. Plant lots of stuff, attract lots of different bees, don't get down a narrow route. But I have tried some monofloral honeys, and you can harvest them more sustainably, where you're not just like, narrowing the bee's diet, but you just pull a frame or 2 off when there's a predominant flower and you get most dominant flavors. But I've actually never tried like a dominated maybe because people are worried that it would be too. I will have to seek that down. I do have a friend of mine, Sarah Wyndham Lewis, and she is a honey sommelier. So there is a course in Italy that you can get this qualification. And I've spent quite a bit of time with her. We've done events together, and she's just marvelous in every respect, and her husband's a beekeeper. But I'll have to ask her. I bet she'll know. She will have the answer to that question.
So that leads us on to honey. I would love you to talk about, the thing that I find really fantastic in your book is the idea of using honey as the prime ingredient. In a way, we've got so conditioned to use it as a sweetener, but there are so many of your recipes where it's more fundamental than that. But also this thing that less is more. So there's sort of little plastic bear that you squeeze out. That totally pasteurized, chemicalized honey is not the ingredient that we're talking about, is it?
Not at all. No. I mean, often that ends up being sugar that the bees have processed, or it's mix of lots of different honeys that have been heated to kind of bring them all together. And then it's quite far away from when you take some comb, like, you know, take a frame out and have a little bit of honey from the comb. I mean, that is the purest, most delicious thing. We do that on the beekeeping courses at River Cottage. Normally they're in the spring, and the apiary is framed by gorse at the moment. So there's probably some like coconutty notes going into the honey, but hawthorn is normally really prolific when we're pulling those frames out, and the flavor is really, really beautiful. You do get these kind of like rosy, appley notes because they're all sort of bound in the same family. But it's a very different product. And I think my main aim with that section of the book, it was a tricky one because I really am saying, you know, be really mindful with honey. You know, it takes, for a teaspoon of honey, it's the life's work of 12 bees. And they spend hours making those little drops. So when they bring the nectar in from, you know, the flowers into the hive, they will mix it with all the enzymes. So it's not just the nectar, it's mixed with their enzymes. That's why it's so healthy as well. You're getting amazing plant food, and then it's mixed with their enzymes, and then they deposit it into the cells that they've made themselves. And one of the worker bees is tasked with fanning the honey for about an hour to reduce it down, so the moisture is driven down so it doesn't ferment. But bees actually do like a bit of fermentation as well. They create something called bee bread, and it's pollen that they also mix with their enzymes, a little bit of honey, and they pack it down really tightly into the cells, and that's like their really densely nutritious stores for the winter and when they need extra energy. So they actually, and it is a fermented product, which is quite fascinating, but they don't want it going to mead because they're a bit teetotal. So I've heard about beekeepers opening hives where all the honey had been fermenting and the bees got a little bit too drunk off of it. So they fan it. So it's a massive process. So my goal with the recipes was to do lovely recipes that celebrate honey but use small amounts. And really, I always add it at the end, so I've never heated it because you're destroying all the benefits. And God, I love a piece of honey cake, so I had to do something that had honey cake in it, but I didn't use any honey in the baking of the cake, and I just glaze it over like you do with the lemon and sugar when you make a drizzle for lemon drizzle cake. But it's like that. And I didn't actually use sugar in any of the recipes too. So I've used dates and fruits and you know, lovely things to keep the health benefits too, to really you know, have that balance that's healthy in all respects.
Fantastic. And a couple more recipes, maybe 2 real favorites of yours?
Well, one is actually it was often when I'm doing recipe development and shooting, shooting sounds like an aggressive word, but I'm photographing a book. We do all the River Cottage handbooks quite organically in terms of the photography. We go to the farm and just find lovely surfaces and start, you know, photographing. And I always see something that inspires a recipe for the book. And in this instance, we were photographing in the summer, and the polytunnel was full of all of its amazing myriad of shades of different tomatoes. And I made this really lovely, simple dressing for the tomatoes that I've made this gorgeous salad, and we photographed it in the outdoor cookery school. So honey and dressings. But I have a really lovely, there's quite a bit of fermenting in the book. So I do a recipe for how to make your own honey vinegar, and I've played around with those so you can add different fruits too. So I've been experimenting with making vinegars with different honeys and also different varieties of apple. If you add a bit of fruit scrap to it, it adds extra yeast and helps kickstart the fermentation process. So you can do sort of, you know, lovely sort of Cox apple with the chestnut honey and play around with pairings in that way. But I did one of my favorite recipes. I mean, honey and pork go really nicely together, and I don't eat loads of meat, but pork belly, this is one of my signature dishes actually, but pork belly roasted on a bed of rhubarb with fresh elderflower, and then right at the end glaze it with honey. And I often make I do some more ferments, but there's a kombucha called Jun, Jun, that's made with honey. And often when the elderflower's out, I just stuff it full of elderflower and get those flavors and then use that to finish off that dish. And it is really spectacular.
Fantastic. Well, that is a taster for you all, everybody. And it's, so nice to chat, Rachel. And anything else you want to tell anyone about?
Well, I guess one of the main things I'd love to encourage people with the book, and that we've really touched on the planting, but, to learn about different bees. There's so many different species. People just often, not always, but often focus on honeybees. But even within the honeybee spectrum, there's lots of different species of honeybee. So really, learn about different bees, find a red-tailed bumblebee and, in the book, I've done a guide to different bees and where you can find them and what time of year they're out. But, just look more and listen more and enjoy that connection with nature, because it's so enriching. I've just spent the past 24 hours outdoors camping with some foragers, and it was cold, but I feel so enriched by just being outdoors, for that amount of time and being more in tune to nature, which I think we're just really missing that connection. And that's really, everything I do is all going back to that, just, that connection with where we come from and our landscape.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for chatting. And Rachel's book is out already. And if you want to hear more of her teaching, go to River Cottage or come to Perch Hill in the early summer. And thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks so much for listening to me and Rachel on bees, something that I'm obviously passionate about. Next week, I'm on my own and I'm going to be doing my mid-April walk around the garden. Of course, tulips at their absolute sort of peak. And so a lovely time to engage with the garden at Perch Hill. So that's part of my Walking Around the Garden series with just me. So see you then. You can find more information, photos and advice sheets on all the plants and recipes we talk about on this podcast by heading to the show notes or at sarahraven.com/podcast.